The morning mist clung to the windows of Clarence's house as Camilla sat in her private sitting room, staring at the untouched breakfast tray before her. The servants had learned not to disturb her during these quiet hours, when the weight of recent events seemed to press down upon her shoulders like an invisible burden. Her fingers traced the rim of her teacup, now cold. As memories of happier times flickered through her mind like old photographs, Charles had changed. Everyone could see it, though few dared to speak of it openly. The coronation had transformed him from the patient heir into something harder, more distant. The crown that had finally settled upon his head after decades of waiting seemed to have erected invisible walls around him, separating him from those who had stood by his side through the darkest periods of his life. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It began with small things: canceled private dinners, shortened conversations, and a formality that crept into their interactions like frost on autumn leaves. Where once they had shared intimate moments discussing poetry, architecture, and their shared love of the countryside, now their conversations revolved around state matters, official duties. In the endless parade of royal obligations, Camilla remembered the man who had written her love letters, filled with vulnerability and humor, who had found solace in her presence during the tumultuous years following Diana's death. That man seemed to be disappearing, replaced by a monarch who viewed personal relationships as potential liabilities rather than sources of strength. The palace staff whispered about his increasing isolation, how he would spend hours alone in his study, surrounded by state papers and constitutional documents. The irony wasn't lost on her that she had waited so long to become queen consort, only to find herself more alone than ever. The public duties continued, the charitable work proceeded as scheduled. But the private moments that had sustained their relationship for decades were becoming increasingly rare. She found herself scheduling appointments through his private secretary, the same man who had once sought her counsel on the most personal matters, now treating her like another item on his royal agenda. Their shared interests, once the foundation of their bond, seemed to matter less in the face of constitutional responsibilities. The garden projects they had planned together remained unfinished. The books they had intended to read side by side, gathering dust on bedside tables. Even their beloved dogs seemed to sense the change, often finding Camilla alone in rooms where Charles's presence had once been a constant. The palace corridors that had once felt like home now echoed with a loneliness that surprised her with its intensity. She had known that becoming queen consort would change things, but she hadn't anticipated how profoundly it would alter the very essence of their relationship. The man she had loved for decades was still there, physically present at state functions and family gatherings, but emotionally he seemed to be drifting further away with each passing day. Friends noticed the change in her demeanor during private gatherings. The quick wit and infectious laughter that had charmed Charles for so many years appeared less frequently now. In their place was a quiet dignity that masked a growing sense of disconnection from the life she had thought they would build together. The future queen consort was learning that sometimes the greatest distances exist between two people sharing the same palace, the same title, and the same public life, yet living in increasingly separate worlds. As the morning sun finally broke through the mist, illuminating the room where she sat in contemplation, Camilla couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental was shifting in the very foundations of the life they had built together. The crown that had been Charles's greatest ambition was becoming the wedge that slowly but surely drove them apart, one royal duty at a time. The breaking point arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in late autumn, disguised as a routine conversation about the upcoming Christmas arrangements. Camilla had approached Charles in his study, where he sat surrounded by red boxes containing state papers that seemed to multiply with each passing hour. The room smelled of leather-bound books and the faint aroma of his afternoon tea, creating an atmosphere that had once felt intimate but now seemed formal and forbidding. She had hoped to discuss their traditional Christmas retreat to Sandringham, particularly their private traditions that had developed over the years of their marriage. These small rituals had become precious to her. The quiet morning walks through the estate, the shared reading of Christmas cards from friends, and the precious moments when the demands of royalty briefly receded, allowing them to simply be Charles and Camilla rather than king and queen consort. His response shattered those hopes with surgical precision. Christmas would be different this year, he explained, without looking up from his papers. The family gathering would be larger, more formal, with additional royal obligations and state considerations taking precedence over personal preferences. Their private moments would be scheduled around constitutional duties, and many of their intimate traditions would need to be abandoned in favor of more public displays of royal unity. The words themselves weren't cruel, but the manner of their delivery struck Camilla like a physical blow. Charles spoke as if discussing arrangements for a state dinner, rather than the dismantling of traditions that had sustained their relationship through years of public scrutiny and personal challenges. His tone was businesslike, efficient, and completely devoid of the warmth that had once characterized their most mundane conversations. What hurt most wasn't the change in plans, but the realization that he had made these decisions without consulting her, without considering how profoundly they would affect the delicate balance they had maintained between public duty and private. She was being informed rather than consulted, treated as a royal appendage rather than the partner who had stood by him through decades of controversy and criticism. The conversation continued with Charles outlining additional changes that would reshape their daily lives. Their shared breakfast routine would be adjusted to accommodate separate morning briefings. Their evening conversations would be replaced by individual preparation sessions for the following day's engagements. Even their weekends would be restructured to maximize royal efficiency. Rather than personal connection, Camilla listened in growing disbelief as the man she had loved for so long systematically dismantled the framework of their shared life with the same methodical approach he brought to constitutional matters. Each change was logical from a royal perspective, defensible in terms of duty and efficiency. Yet collectively, they represented the complete subordination of their personal relationship to the demands of the crown. She attempted to express her concerns, to remind him of the importance of maintaining some private space within their public lives. But her words seemed to bounce off an invisible barrier that had formed around him. He listened politely, as he might listen to a concerned citizen during a royal walkabout. But his responses made it clear that the decisions were final, non-negotiable. The study fell silent, except for the ticking of the antique clock on the mantelpiece, each second marking the passage of time that had once belonged to them, but now belonged entirely to the crown. Camilla realized that she was witnessing the death of their partnership and the birth of a relationship defined entirely by protocol and public expectation. As she left the study, closing the heavy oak door behind her, she understood that the conversation had marked more than just a change in their Christmas plans. It had been the formal notification that Charles the man was being completely absorbed by Charles the king, and that there was no longer room in his life for the messy, complicated, but ultimately sustaining reality of genuine human connection. The weeks following that devastating conversation passed in a strange twilight of maintained appearances and growing emotional distance. Camilla found herself navigating a marriage that had become indistinguishable from a carefully choreographed state partnership. They appeared together at public functions with practiced smiles and appropriate gestures, their decades of experience allowing them to project unity while privately drifting further apart than ever before. The palace staff began to notice the changes. Though their professional discretion prevented open discussion of the obvious tension, Camilla's lady-in-waiting observed how Her Majesty would pause before entering rooms where the king was present, as if gathering strength for a performance rather than seeking the comfort of her husband's company. The private secretaries coordinated their schedules with military precision, but the spontaneous visits and impromptu conversations that had once characterized their relationship became extinct. Charles seemed oblivious to the profound impact of his transformation, or perhaps he had convinced himself that this evolution was both necessary and beneficial. He threw himself into royal duties with unprecedented intensity, as if trying to prove to himself and the nation that he had been worth the long wait for the throne. Every minute of his day was accounted for, every interaction measured against its potential value to the monarchy. During state dinners, Camilla watched her husband charm foreign dignitaries and heads of state with the same enthusiasm he had once reserved for their private conversations about art and literature. She saw him laugh genuinely at diplomatic jokes while remaining stone-faced during family gatherings. The irony was painful. The man who had spent years being criticized as emotionally distant from the public was now giving his warmest moments to strangers, while withholding them from those closest to him. Their shared bedchamber became another casualty of royal efficiency. Charles began retiring earlier to accommodate dawn briefings. Camilla found herself staying up later, reluctant to enter a space that had become as formal as any other room in the palace. When they did occupy the room simultaneously, they moved around each other with the polite consideration of well-trained hotel guests rather than lovers who had shared intimacies for decades. The gardens at Highgrove, once their refuge and shared passion project, fell into subtle neglect. Charles still walked the grounds during his abbreviated weekend visits, but alone. His attention divided between the landscape and the mobile phone that kept him connected to London and his constitutional responsibilities. Camilla would watch from the windows as he passed by flower beds they had planted together. Now unrecognizable from years of inattention, Christmas arrived with all the pomp and ceremony Charles had demanded, but none of the warmth that had traditionally marked the season for their family. The expanded guest lists and formal protocols created a celebration that satisfied constitutional requirements while crushing the spirit of joy that had once defined their holiday gatherings. Camilla performed her role flawlessly, but inside she mourned the loss of simple pleasures like choosing gifts together or sharing quiet moments by the fire. The new year brought fresh challenges as Charles announced additional modifications to their daily routines. Their traditional Sunday morning church attendance would be expanded to include more frequent public appearances at religious services. Their charitable work, once chosen based on personal passion and shared interests, would now be coordinated to maximize royal impact and media coverage. Even their choice of reading material was subject to consideration of how it might reflect on the monarchy. Friends who had known them as a couple for years began to comment privately on the change in their dynamic. Invitations to intimate dinner parties were politely declined in favor of larger, more formal gatherings that served royal networking purposes. The spontaneous weekend visits to friends' country houses, once a cherished escape from royal pressures, were replaced by carefully planned royal visits that served constitutional objectives. Camilla realized that she was witnessing the complete absorption of her husband by the institution he had served all his life. The crown that had finally come to him was demanding not just his service, but his soul, leaving no room for the man she had fallen in love with decades earlier. The moment that would define everything came during a quiet Sunday evening in March, when the daffodils were beginning to bloom in the palace gardens and the promise of spring seemed to mock the winter that had settled over their marriage. Camilla had discovered Charles in the blue drawing room, standing before the window that overlooked the gardens they had once explored together with the enthusiasm of newlyweds. Despite their mature years, she approached him with the tentative hope that perhaps the changing season might soften his heart, might remind him of the man he had been before the crown had claimed him so completely. In her hands, she carried a leather-bound book of poetry they had once read aloud to each other during their courtship, its pages marked with personal inscriptions and shared memories that had sustained them through the darkest periods of public scrutiny. The book represented everything their relationship had been, built upon intellectual connection, shared aesthetic appreciation, and the kind of intimate communication that had flourished away from the glare of public attention. She had hoped that returning to these foundations might bridge the chasm that had opened between them, might remind Charles that kingship need not require the complete sacrifice of personal happiness. His reaction was more devastating than outright rejection would have been. Charles looked at the book with the polite interest he might show to a gift from a well-meaning but misguided subject. He thanked her courteously, set it aside without opening it, and immediately returned to discussing the upcoming state visit from the Australian Prime Minister. The dismissal was gentle but absolute, marking the final death of their shared intellectual life. What followed was perhaps the most honest conversation they had shared in months, though it left Camilla feeling more isolated than ever. Charles explained with the patient tone he might use with a concerned citizen during a royal walkabout that his responsibilities as king required complete dedication. Personal interests, private pleasures, and even marital intimacy had to be subordinated. To the greater good of the monarchy and the nation it served, he spoke of duty as if it were a sacred calling that demanded the sacrifice of everything human and vulnerable within him. The man who had once written passionate letters about his need for understanding and connection now seemed to view such needs as weaknesses to be conquered rather than essential aspects of his humanity to be cherished and protected. Camilla listened as he outlined his vision of their future together, a partnership based on mutual respect and shared commitment to royal service, but stripped of the messy complications of genuine emotional intimacy. They would continue to present a united front to the public, support each other's charitable endeavors, and maintain the dignity appropriate to their stations. But the private moments that had sustained their relationship would be casualties in service of something he deemed more important. The cruelest aspect of his explanation was its reasonableness. Every point he made could be defended logically. Every sacrifice justified in terms of constitutional necessity and public service. He wasn't being deliberately cruel or thoughtlessly selfish. He was simply choosing the crown over everything else, including the woman who had stood by him through decades of public criticism and personal struggle. As he spoke, Camilla realized she was watching the completion of a transformation that had been months in the making. The Charles she had known, vulnerable, passionate, sometimes uncertain, but always deeply human, was being systematically dismantled and replaced by a figure of constitutional perfection who had no room for the complications of genuine love. The conversation ended with Charles returning to his state papers while Camilla remained by the window, watching the daffodils sway in the evening breeze. The poetry book lay forgotten on a side table, its presence now seeming almost quaint in a room dominated by red boxes containing matters of state. She understood that she had just witnessed the formal end of their marriage as anything more than a royal arrangement, though the ceremony marking that conclusion would never appear in any official record. The grief that followed was unlike anything Camilla had experienced. Even during the darkest days of public vilification following Diana's death, this was a more private agony, the mourning of a relationship that continued to exist in public while dying slowly in private. She found herself grieving not just for what was lost, but for what would never be recovered. Even if Charles were to suddenly recognize the devastation his choices had wrought, the palace routines continued with clockwork precision. But Camilla moved through them like a woman walking through a familiar landscape that had been fundamentally altered by some natural disaster. The rooms where they had once shared intimate conversations now felt like museum spaces, preserved but no longer lived in. The staff, trained in discretion, maintained their professional demeanor, while undoubtedly noting the subtle but profound changes in the royal household's atmosphere. Sleep became elusive during those dark spring nights. Camilla would lie awake, listening to Charles's steady breathing beside her, marveling at how completely he had convinced himself that his transformation was both necessary and beneficial. He slept peacefully while she wrestled with the reality of loving someone who was disappearing before her eyes, not through death or betrayal, but through a deliberate choice to sacrifice everything personal for something he believed to be more important. The charitable work that had once been a source of shared passion became another reminder of what was lost. Charles would appear at the same events, deliver perfectly crafted speeches about causes they had once discussed with genuine enthusiasm, and interact with her with the courteous professionalism he showed to other members of the royal family. The causes remained the same, but the man championing them had become a stranger wearing her husband's face. Friends who attempted to reach out found themselves carefully managed by private secretaries and protocol officers. The informal dinner parties and casual weekend visits that had once provided relief from royal pressures were replaced by formal engagements that served specific constitutional purposes. Even their oldest friends began to feel like they were interacting with an institution rather than the people they had known for decades. The irony wasn't lost on Camilla that she had finally achieved the acceptance and respect she had sought for so long, only to discover that victory felt hollow when shared with someone who had become emotionally unavailable. The public approval that had been so hard-won now seemed meaningless when the private relationship that had sustained her through years of criticism was withering away. Spring turned to summer, and Camilla found herself spending increasing time alone in the gardens, seeking solace among the flowers that had once been a shared passion. The roses Charles had planted for their wedding anniversary bloomed magnificently, but he was too busy with state matters to notice their perfection. She would sit among them in the early morning hours before the day's official duties began, treasuring these moments of peace in a life that had become dominated by ceremonial obligations. The transformation was so complete that even their adult children began to comment privately on their father's distance. Family gatherings that had once been warm and spontaneous became formal affairs governed by protocol and timing considerations. Charles interacted with his sons and stepchildren with the same benevolent attention he showed to young people. During royal visits, kind, interested, but fundamentally detached, Camilla realized that grief wasn't something she could work through and overcome in this situation. Unlike the grief that follows death, where healing eventually becomes possible, this was an ongoing loss that was renewed each day as she witnessed the continued erosion of the man she had loved. Each morning brought fresh evidence that Charles was choosing his role as king over his identity as a husband, father, and human being. The weight of maintaining public appearances while privately mourning became exhausting. Camilla found herself preparing for each public engagement like an actress taking the stage, summoning the energy to project warmth and contentment while feeling increasingly isolated and bereft. The performance was flawless, but the cost was becoming impossible to bear in silence. The memory that would haunt everyone present occurred during a state banquet in late summer, when the evening light streaming through the palace windows created the kind of golden atmosphere that had once moved Charles' spontaneous poetry and tender observations about the beauty of ordinary moments. The banquet hall was filled with distinguished guests, glittering with formal attire and sparkling with the finest royal jewelry. Creating a scene of magnificent pageantry, Camilla sat beside Charles at the head table, performing her role with the grace and dignity that had become second nature after decades of public life. To the assembled guests and watching cameras, they appeared to be the perfect royal couple, united, dignified, and completely in harmony with their ceremonial roles. The king delivered a speech that was both eloquent and moving, touching on themes of service, duty, and the enduring strength of institutional commitment. But those who knew them well could see what others missed. Camilla's smile never wavered throughout the evening. Yet there was something in her eyes that spoke of profound sorrow barely contained beneath the surface of royal composure. When Charles rose to deliver his speech, praising the virtues of duty and sacrifice, she watched him with an expression that mixed admiration for his performance with grief for the man who had been lost in its creation. The moment that etched itself into memory came during the traditional toast to the visiting dignitaries. As Charles raised his glass and spoke eloquently about partnership, mutual respect, and enduring bonds, Camilla's composure finally cracked in the most subtle but devastating way. A single tear escaped, rolling slowly down her cheek as she maintained her perfect smile and raised her own glass in support of her husband's words. The tear was caught by the palace photographer, though the image would never be released for public viewing. Those who witnessed it understood. They were seeing something both beautiful and heartbreaking. The visible manifestation of a woman's grief for a love that had been sacrificed on the altar of constitutional duty. The irony was almost unbearable. Charles spoke passionately about the importance of enduring partnerships, while remaining completely oblivious to the dissolution of his own. What made the moment unforgettable was not just Camilla's visible emotion, but the way it illuminated the profound tragedy of their situation. Here was a man who had finally achieved everything he had worked toward his entire life, speaking eloquently about values he genuinely believed in, while unconsciously destroying the relationship that had sustained him through his darkest years. The cost of his transformation was written on his wife's face for anyone with eyes to see. The dinner continued with perfect protocol. But the staff who had served the royal family for years recognized they had witnessed something significant. In years to come, they would remember this evening as the moment when the full cost of royal duty became visible, when the human price of institutional perfection was displayed for anyone willing to look closely enough to see it. After the guests departed and the palace returned to its nighttime quiet, Camilla sat alone in her sitting room, still wearing her formal gown and jewelry. Staring at her reflection in the antique mirror that had witnessed decades of royal history, she looked every inch the queen consort she had finally become. But the woman looking back at her was someone she barely recognized, elegant, dignified, and utterly alone despite being surrounded by the trappings of the highest social achievement. The transformation was complete on both sides. Charles had successfully molded himself into the perfect constitutional monarch, efficient and dedicated beyond reproach. Camilla had learned to carry her grief with the same grace she brought to every other aspect of her royal role, creating a performance so convincing that even those closest to her might miss the depth of her loss. In the end, they had both achieved exactly what the crown demanded of them: the complete subordination of personal happiness to institutional necessity. The memory of that single tear would serve as a reminder to all who witnessed it, that even the most glittering achievements can exact a price too profound for public acknowledgement, creating losses that can only be mourned in the private spaces between official duties and ceremonial obligations.